The radio operator's fingers trembled slightly as he passed the decoded message to Commander Joseph Rochefort. In the stuffy underground bunker of Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, the air hung heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. It was May 27th, 1942, and what Rochefort held in his hands would alter the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese were planning to attack Midway Atoll in less than a week. "AF is short of water," Rochefort murmured, reading the intercept again. The bait had worked. When American intelligence deliberately planted false information that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down, using the code designation, the Japanese had repeated this detail in their own encrypted communications. The trap confirmed what Rochefort had suspected for weeks. AF was the Japanese code for Midway. This account draws from declassified naval intelligence documents, as detailed in Gordon Pranga's Miracle at Midway, McGraw-Hill, 1982. Wantor. The other side of the world, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat aboard his flagship Yamato, confident in his elaborate plan to draw out and destroy what remained of the American fleet. The mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack had devised a complex operation involving multiple fleet movements, feints toward the Aleutian Islands, and a decisive hammer blow at Midway. His intelligence officers had assured him that the Americans remained ignorant of his intentions. They were catastrophically wrong. In the humid basement rooms of Pearl Harbor, America was fighting an invisible war of intercepts, code books, and analytical genius. Rochefort's team of linguists, mathematicians, and chess players worked around the clock, subsisting on coffee and catnaps, to break the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Many wore pajamas under their uniforms, having spent days without leaving their stations. Admiral Chester Nimitz faced an excruciating decision. Should he trust these code breakers, these eccentric intellectuals with their statistical analyses and intuitive leaps, or follow conventional wisdom? The Japanese fleet significantly outgunned his forces. Conventional naval doctrine would demand he consolidate his carriers near Hawaii, not risk them in a forward position near Midway. "If you're wrong," Nimitz told Rochefort during their critical meeting, "it means the Japanese will have a clear path to Hawaii, perhaps even the West Coast." Rochefort, hollow-eyed from exhaustion, met the Admiral's gaze. "We're not wrong, sir." The date was May 30th, 1942. As Japanese warships steamed eastward across the Pacific in radio silence, they remained unaware that their meticulously constructed surprise had evaporated. Admiral Yamamoto's plan required perfect timing and coordination between 5 separate force groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean, a masterpiece of naval planning undermined by an invisible battle of intellect. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, stood beside Nimitz as they reviewed the intelligence estimate once more. "The Japanese believe we have only 2 operational carriers in the Pacific, sir. They don't know Enterprise and Hornet have returned from the Doolittle raid, and they certainly don't know Yorktown survived the Coral Sea battle." Nimitz nodded grimly. "Then, for once, we will be the ones delivering the surprise." As dawn broke, on June 1st, 1942, American fleet submarines took up positions northwest of Midway, while the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown moved into position northeast of the atoll. Above them flew PBY Catalina patrol planes, their crews scanning the horizon for the first glimpse of the approaching Japanese armada. The invisible battle, fought with radio waves, code books, and human intellect, was about to materialize into one of history's most consequential naval engagements. The fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. The Japanese carrier Akagi cut through Pacific swells with predatory grace, its flight deck bustling with activity as mechanics prepared the first wave of bombers for the assault on Midway. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Carrier Striking Force, stood on the bridge with the confidence of a man who had helped orchestrate the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Dawn was approaching on June 4th, 1942, and his 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most formidable naval air power assembled in the Pacific. What Nagumo couldn't see were the electronic ghosts haunting his operation. The Japanese admiral remained blind to American preparations, while nearly every move of his fleet had been anticipated by enemy intelligence. As chronicled in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings, October 1975, the BOA, intelligence advantage provided by code breaking, has been described as knowing the enemy's cards in a high-stakes poker game. Aboard the USS Hyperion, a small vessel officially classified as a converted minesweeper, but actually serving as a radio intelligence ship, technicians monitored Japanese communications with sophisticated equipment. Though the enemy maintained strict radio silence during their approach, the previous weeks had provided enough intercepted traffic to construct a remarkably accurate picture of Japanese intentions. Lieutenant Commander Harold Kemp wiped condensation from his glasses as he examined the latest intelligence summary. "They still think we're in the dark," he remarked to his executive officer. "And their operational plan is so complex, so dependent on precise timing between multiple force groups, that they've left themselves vulnerable." 200 miles northeast of Midway, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied his charts. A methodical, cautious tactician, Spruance had been thrust into carrier command following the injury of Admiral William Halsey. Now, he commanded Task Force 16, with orders that contradicted conventional naval doctrine, to place his precious carriers in harm's way, based largely on intelligence derived from code breaking. Radio detection bearing equipment report signals, consistent with Japanese scout planes, his communications officer reported. Spruance nodded. The Japanese were adhering to their timetable, just as Rochefort had predicted. On Midway itself, radar operators peered at the primitive screens of their SCR-270 radar sets. Installed just weeks earlier, these early warning systems represented the cutting edge of electronic warfare. At 0545 hours, the radar operator's voice crackled over the command post telephone. "Large formation of aircraft bearing 265 degrees, distance 110 miles and closing." The invisible electronic web had caught its first tangible prey. Marine Captain Walter Sweeney raced for his Brewster Buffalo fighter as air raid sirens wailed across the atoll. The Midway garrison had been reinforced with every available aircraft, from obsolete Buffaloes to the more capable Wildcats, along with dive bombers and torpedo planes. The defenders knew what was coming because American intelligence had provided the battle plan days in advance. By 0620 hours, the Japanese strike force found Midway alert and waiting. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky as American fighters intercepted the incoming bombers. Though outnumbered and outclassed by the veteran Japanese pilots, the defending aviators disrupted the enemy's carefully orchestrated attack. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo received reports of stronger-than-expected resistance. Worse, his scout planes reported no American carriers in the vicinity, exactly as expected, but one scout was overdue. At 0728, the missing scout finally radioed a sighting that sent shockwaves through the Japanese command. American warships to the northeast. The invisible battle suddenly materialized. Nagumo faced an excruciating dilemma. His first wave of aircraft were returning, needing to land, while his reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship attacks, not the fragmentation bombs needed for a second strike on Midway. As he hesitated, American dive bombers from the carriers that shouldn't have been there were already en route, guided by radar and intelligence that had placed their enemy precisely where they expected to find them. In the cramped radio room of the USS Hornet, Ensign Ronald Jenkins hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed tightly against his ears. His job was to monitor Japanese communications frequencies, though the enemy maintained near-perfect radio silence during battle operations. It was 9:20 hours on June 4, 1942, and the young officer knew American dive bombers were already en route to strike the Japanese carriers. What the Japanese didn't realize was how thoroughly their vaunted JN-25 naval code had been compromised. The code, which they believed unbreakable, had been under systematic attack by American cryptanalysts since 1940. According to The Emperor's Codes by Michael Smith, Arcade Publishing, 2000, the breaking of Japanese naval ciphers represented perhaps the most consequential intelligence triumph of the Pacific War. 6 months earlier, In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had redoubled their efforts. Commander Rochefort's Station Hypo team in Hawaii worked in shifts around the clock, compiling frequency tables, analyzing message patterns, and gradually reconstructing the Japanese codebook. By April 1942, they could read approximately 15% of intercepted Japanese naval messages, just enough to detect the looming threat to Midway. The Japanese, confident in their cryptographic security, continued to transmit sensitive operational details. When planners in Tokyo had debated whether to attack the Aleutians as a diversion before or simultaneously with Midway, American cryptanalysts were reading their deliberations with growing clarity. Now, as American bombers searched for the Japanese fleet, the fruits of this invisible cryptographic battle were about to be harvested in devastating fashion. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Air Group Commander from the Enterprise, faced a critical decision. Having reached the expected location of the Japanese fleet and finding empty ocean, he had to choose a search pattern with dwindling fuel supplies. Based on intelligence briefings that emphasized Japanese naval doctrine and expected formations, McCluskey made an educated guess and turned northwest. At 10:20 hours, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer hurrying to rejoin the carrier force. Following this visual clue, the American strike groups found all 4 Japanese carriers with aircraft on their decks, refueling and rearming for their own strike against the recently discovered American fleet. Admiral Nagumo had finally decided to prepare for an attack on the American carriers, ordering his reserve aircraft to be rearmed from land attack to anti-ship weapons. This process required clear flight decks, meaning defensive fighter patrols had been reduced. Fuel lines stretched across decks crowded with bombs and torpedoes as aircraft were serviced. It was the moment of maximum vulnerability, precisely when American dive bombers arrived overhead. Within 6 devastating minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into infernos. Only the Hiryu escaped the initial onslaught, launching a counterstrike that would cripple the USS Yorktown before being destroyed itself by the afternoon. Aboard the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stared in disbelief as flames consumed Japan's premier carrier. How had the Americans known? How had they positioned their forces perfectly? The answer lay not in conventional espionage, but in the invisible battle of cryptography. In Pearl Harbor, Commander Rochefort received the first reports of the battle's outcome with exhausted satisfaction. His team had provided the critical advantage, yet the true extent of American code-breaking success would remain one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. President Franklin Roosevelt would be briefed on the victory with explicit instructions, never to reveal how the American fleet had been in position to ambush the Japanese. The official explanation would credit superior intelligence without specifics. The battle's stunning reversal of fortune, 4 Japanese carriers sunk at the Ypres, cost of 1 American, stemmed directly from the shadowy contest between codemakers and codebreakers. For the Japanese, who would never fully accept that their naval codes had been broken, the defeat remained a puzzling disaster, attributed to bad luck and American determination. Lieutenant Howard Brown wiped sweat from his forehead as he monitored the SC radar set aboard the USS Yorktown. The primitive cathode ray tube displayed ghostly blips representing incoming aircraft. It was early afternoon on June 4, 1942, and the morning's stunning success against 3 Japanese carriers had electrified the American fleet. But Brown knew the battle wasn't over. Bogies bearing 270, distance 45 miles, he called out, his voice tense. The Yorktown's Combat Information Center immediately relayed the warning. Within minutes, fighters were scrambling from the carrier's deck to intercept what would be the counterattack from the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu. As documented in The Two-Ocean War by Samuel Eliot Morison, Little Brown and Company 1963. Radar gave American forces precious minutes of warning that meant the difference between effective defense and disaster. Radar, still in its technological infancy, represented another dimension of the invisible battle shaping Midway's outcome. The Japanese Navy, despite its many technical advantages, had lagged critically in radar development. Most Japanese carriers lacked any early warning system beyond visual observation from scout planes and lookouts with binoculars. American carriers, by contrast, carried the SC air search radar, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges up to 75 miles under ideal conditions. This technological edge provided crucial warning time to organize defenses against incoming strikes. As the Japanese attack squadrons from Hiryu approached the Yorktown, they encountered a prepared defender. Fighter Director Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson used the radar data to vector the carrier's Wildcat fighters into optimal interception positions. Though many Japanese bombers broke through, the carrier's defenses were fully alerted. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered evasive maneuvers as the first bombs fell. The Yorktown's radical turns avoided several torpedoes, but two eventually found their mark, leaving the carrier listing and vulnerable. Set damage control parties to sections. Baker and Charlie, Buckmaster ordered as fires spread below decks. The Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea battle just 1 month earlier, had been hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor in an extraordinary 72-hour effort. Now she fought for survival once again. Miles away, aboard the Hiryu, Commander Yamaguchi received reports of successful hits on an American carrier. With grim determination, he ordered preparation of a second strike force, unaware that American search planes were already hunting for his vessel. Late that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Hiryu and dealt the fatal blow. Within hours, all 4 Japanese carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier were burning ruins. Admiral Nimitz, monitoring reports from Pearl Harbor, recognized the decisive nature of what was unfolding. The technological and intelligence advantages, radar, code-breaking, and radio intelligence, had combined with the courage of American pilots to achieve what would later be called the miracle of Midway. As night fell on June 4th, the burning hulks of Japanese carriers illuminated the Pacific darkness. Aboard the American vessels, radar operators maintained their vigilant electronic watch, scanning for any further threats that might emerge from the darkness. The Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, would eventually succumb to her wounds in a submarine attack 2 days later. But the sacrifice had been worth the price. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. In Tokyo, officials at Imperial General Headquarters struggled to comprehend the disaster. How had their meticulously planned operation unraveled so completely? The answer lay partly in technology they had underestimated, the electronic sentinels that had provided American forces with an invisible shield against surprise. Emperor Hirohito received the news with stoic resignation. The supposedly invincible combined fleet had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Japan's offensive capability had been crippled in a single day by adversaries who seemed to anticipate their every move. The invisible, electronic war, fought with radar waves, radio interception, and direction-finding equipment, had proven just as decisive as the more visible struggle of aircraft and ships. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the Pacific waters northwest of Midway concealed a retreat of historic proportions. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the super battleship Yamato 300 miles from the battlefield, had made the painful decision to withdraw the combined fleet following the loss of all 4 carriers. His elaborate battle plan, with its multiple force groups and planned occupation of Midway, had disintegrated. What Yamamoto couldn't know was how completely American intelligence had unraveled his scheme before it even began. The invisible battle of deception and counter-deception had been as important as the more visible clash of carriers. Historical analysis published in the Naval War College Review, summer 1998, concluded that Japanese operational security failures were as significant as American code-breaking success in determining Midway's outcome. In the Yazii weeks leading up to the battle, Japanese planners had created an elaborate deception. The attack on the remote Aleutian Islands was intended to draw American naval forces northward, away from Midway. Radio traffic was carefully manipulated to suggest fleet movements that weren't occurring. False information was deliberately planted in communications channels the Japanese believed secure. But American signals intelligence officers had developed sophisticated traffic analysis techniques. By studying patterns of transmissions, even without breaking the content of every message, they could identify command relationships, fleet movements, and operational tempos that revealed Japanese intentions. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, one of Rochefort's key officers at Station Hypo, had devised the critical water shortage ruse that confirmed Midway as the Japanese objective. Now he studied the latest direction-finding plots that tracked the Japanese withdrawal. "They're retiring westward at high speed," he reported to Rochefort. "The main body is still largely intact, but they've abandoned the invasion plans completely." The Japanese retreat marked the first major strategic reversal for an empire that had experienced 6 months of uninterrupted conquest across the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor through the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces had seemed unstoppable. Now, the tide had turned. Admiral Spruance, commanding the American carrier force, made the conservative decision not to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet into waters where enemy submarines and land-based aircraft might hold the advantage. Some officers criticized this caution, but Nimitz would later endorse Spruance's judgment. "You fought the right battle at the right time in the right place." In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff struggled to contain the damage, not just to their fleet, but to the narrative of Japanese invincibility. The official announcement mentioned only that the occupation of Midway has been temporarily postponed. No mention was made of carrier losses. Emperor Hirohito, receiving a more candid briefing, asked pointed questions about how American forces had anticipated the attack. Naval intelligence officers could offer no satisfactory explanation, still confident in their code security. The truth, that American cryptanalysts had been reading portions of their most secure communications, remained beyond their comprehension. The Japanese would change codebooks and procedures following Midway, but American codebreakers would continue to penetrate their systems throughout the war. By June 6th, search planes confirmed the Japanese withdrawal was complete. Admiral Nimitz sent a message to all Pacific Fleet units. "Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged." The strategic implications were enormous. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. More significantly, they had lost the initiative. The planned invasion of New Caledonia and Fiji would now be abandoned. Australia was secure from invasion. The imperial perimeter would contract rather than expand. Admiral Yamamoto, who had famously warned that Japan could not win a prolonged war against America's industrial might, now saw his worst fears materializing. The element of surprise, Japan's greatest advantage, had been neutralized by an intelligence apparatus he had underestimated. On Midway Atoll, Marine defenders watched repair crews filling bomb craters and rebuilding shattered installations. The expected invasion had never materialized. Instead, the tiny atoll had served as the anvil upon which Japanese naval power had been hammered. The invisible battle, the contest of deception and counter-deception, of false signals and true intelligence, had proven decisive. American forces had not just won a tactical victory, but had seized the strategic narrative of the Pacific War. 1 month after the Battle of Midway, Commander Joseph Rochefort was called to an unusual meeting at Pearl Harbor headquarters. Despite orchestrating the intelligence triumph that enabled victory, he found himself facing reassignment rather than commendation. His unconventional methods and willingness to challenge orthodoxy had created powerful enemies in Washington. "You're being transferred to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco," his superior informed him with evident discomfort. It was July 7, 1942, and one of the war's greatest intelligence officers was being sidelined at the moment of his greatest contribution. The invisible battle that had shaped Midway's outcome remained too secret to acknowledge. Publicly, too specialized for many naval officers to fully comprehend. According to Joe Rochefort's War by Elliot Carlson, Naval Institute Press, 2011, the bureaucratic politics of naval intelligence denied Rochefort proper recognition for decades after the war. The true narrative of Midway, that American cryptanalysts had read enough of the enemy's code to position limited forces at precisely the right place and time, would remain classified for decades. Officially, the victory was attributed to courage, determination, and the skill of American pilots, all of which were indeed essential factors. Admiral Nimitz, who had staked his command on Rochefort's intelligence, was outraged at the treatment of his codebreaker. But even the Pacific Fleet commander found himself constrained by the need for absolute secrecy, surrounding the code-breaking operation. In Japan, the Naval High Command conducted intensive investigations into the Midway disaster. Without considering that their codes might have been compromised, they focused on operational security lapses, excessive radio transmissions, and the complex battle plan that had dispersed their forces too widely. Emperor Hirohito, in a rare intervention, questioned whether Japan could continue offensive operations given the carrier losses. The planned invasion of the Solomon Islands was scaled back, though the construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal would proceed, setting the stage for the next major confrontation. By August 1942, American Marines would land on Guadalcanal, launching the first American offensive of the Pacific War. The strategic initiative wrested from Japan at Midway would never be relinquished. The invisible dimensions of modern warfare, code-breaking, radar, radio intelligence, and electronic countermeasures had proven as decisive as battleships and aircraft carriers. Yet the men and women who fought this shadow war received little public recognition. In a small ceremony at Station Haipo in Hawaii, Rochefort's team quietly celebrated their contribution before dispersing to new assignments. The knowledge that they had helped change the course of the war would have to serve as its own reward. Remember, Rochefort told his analysts during their farewell gathering, what happened here must never be spoken of. The moment they know we can read their traffic, they'll change everything. The secrecy surrounding Midway's intelligence aspects would persist long after the war. Not until 1976 would the full story begin to emerge through declassified documents and historical research. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on Midway years later, would acknowledge, had we lacked early information of the Japanese movements, and had we been caught with our carriers in Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway would have ended far differently. The legacy of this shadow war extended far beyond 1942. The techniques pioneered by Rochefort's codebreakers and the Aiki, lessons learned about integrating intelligence with operations, would influence military thinking for generations. The National Security Agency, formed after the war, would build upon the foundation laid by these wartime cryptanalysts, for the men who flew the dive bombers that delivered the decisive blows, and for the sailors who fought to save their burning carriers. Midway would always be remembered as a victory won through courage and sacrifice. But historians would eventually recognize the battle's deeper significance. It represented warfare's evolution into a multi-dimensional contest where information could prove as decisive as firepower. On September 18, 1942, President Roosevelt signed a secret memorandum authorizing the creation of an expanded signals intelligence service. Without mentioning Midway specifically, the document noted, recent events have proven beyond any doubt the critical importance of communication intelligence to our national security. The invisible battle, fought with codebooks, radio receivers, and analytical brilliance, had permanently transformed modern warfare. The miracle of Midway had been manufactured as much in soundproof rooms by men in shirt sleeves as on the flight decks of carriers. The Shadow Warriors had changed history, even if their contribution would remain in shadows for decades to come.